Russia and China are closer today than they ever have been. They're both involved in expansionist activities. Russia with Ukraine, and China in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, bullying neighbors such as Taiwan and the Philippines, Vietnam, Japan. Just wondering how you would face that threat.
Let's go down the line, starting with Senator Cruz and then ending with Senator Santorum.
Well, it is a great question, and you're right that we are seeing all across the world bad actors getting worse. The simple reality is that the leaders of the world have taken the measure of President Obama, and they do not perceive any credible threat whatsoever. So as a result, Russia, Putin is not a complicated man. He is essentially a KGB thug. Now, I will give him credit for candor. He has described, in his view, the collapse of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical disaster of modern times. And I believe what Putin is endeavoring to do is reassemble as much of the old Soviet Union as possible. The reason we see such an aggressive and bellicose Putin, the reason we see such an aggressive China, is because the President of the United States is not deemed any check on their expansion. So, for example, let's take when Russia moved into Crimea, when Russia invaded Ukraine. What should a strong president have done? Number one, a strong president should have spoken out at the outset. When tens of thousands were in the Maidan Square in Ukraine, standing for freedom, standing to be with America, standing to be with the West, the president should have spoken out. You know, I walked through the Maidan with a 16-year-old girl who saw her friends shot, teenagers next to her. But beyond that, if Putin had gone forward, the president should have immediately gone forward and installed the anti-ballistic missile batteries that had been promised to go into Poland and the Czech Republic, which Obama had canceled in an effort to appease Putin. Well, appeasement didn't work. In addition to that, the most powerful tool that Russia uses over its neighbors is energy. There were at the time 22 applications pending to export liquid natural gas. The president should have stood up immediately and approved all 22. That would have helped the people of Ukraine and Europe stand free from Russia's domination. It would have hurt Russia where it counts. You know, John McCain has a great phrase. He describes Russia as a gas station with a country attached. And it would have created jobs and economic growth here at home. The same is true with China, that China is expanding because they see America distracted with ISIS, with Iran, and they are pressing on their neighbors. We've got to get back to peace through strength that Ronald Reagan embodied, where our friends and allies can trust us, and our enemies understand that the United States of America is not to be trifled.
I was in China last year, and one of the things that I noticed was the proliferation of consumerism in China. It was remarkable. And everywhere you went, you would see Saks Fifth Avenue, you'd see Louis Vuitton, all these huge, very high-end brands with big stores, bigger than you'd see on Fifth Avenue in New York. And it was very apparent that the extraordinary expansion of their infrastructure, booming economy, major cities, extraordinary expansion of their cities. And the one thing that I noticed was that it seemed like that China was becoming much more like America used to be. And I came home and realized America is becoming much more like China used to be. The Chinese are being given more freedoms, though not nearly enough, and our freedoms are being trampled on. Now, there were certain websites I couldn't access because the Chinese government would block access. You couldn't Google things. You certainly couldn't ask anyone about what happened in Tiananmen Square because that's forbidden to be discussed. Younger people never heard of it because their government oppresses their history. Won't let them know how many millions of people Mao Zedong actually murdered in the creation of communist China. And in some ways I was thinking, gosh, I'm so glad America didn't like that. I'm glad America would never revise and rewrite our own history so that our kids would grow up understanding something different as to who we really are. I'm glad that our government would never spy on us and monitor our every phone call and every email, until I realized, but it does. And the fact is, when you ask the question about China and Russia, and should we be worried, of course we should. Because neither of these nations represent what we have historically represented, which is giving every individual the right to be free, to think what they wanted to think, to believe what they wanted to believe, to worship or not to worship as they wished, to be able to protect themselves with their own weapons of self-protection, to choose their own careers, to make decisions as to how they would be educated. All of these are basic freedoms that, up until recent times, have all been so fundamental to our American experience that we never even debated them. And Democrats and Republicans universally agreed on those things. When I read the Chinese newspapers, every day there was an article about some new partnership between Russia and China. And it was very apparent that these two giants had decided that they had a whole lot more in common with each other than they did with the United States. And that should be troubling to us. What the senator just said about energy policy couldn't be more true. Instead of making it easier for Iran, we ought to be making it harder for them. We ought to be bankrupting them by increasing the sanctions, not relaxing them. If we want to defeat Russia, we don't have to drop a bomb on top of them. We have to unleash the over 700 years of energy that we walk over every day that's right under our own feet. And we become an exporter of energy. Because today we're exporting jobs to places like China, and we're still importing cheap goods that are created by a China that cheats in the trade policy. We need a president who will say, free trade is fine, but fair trade is equally important. And if it isn't fair, it isn't free, and we're going to stop the kind of glut on the marketplace that the Chinese have done that has robbed many of you and your families of jobs that would have been yours in the manufacturing sector, as we continue to look the other way and let China manipulate currency and cheat in the trade process. And if we don't wake up to this and do something quickly and dramatically, then we're going to continue to see these partnerships between nations like Russia and China, which is not in our best interest. And it does not help when the President of the United States, in his inability to ever keep his word, says, oh, there's a red line in Syria. Oh, but now there isn't. And pushes the Syrian president further into the arms of Vladimir Putin. Or when we pick the wrong side in Egypt, and we actually side with the Muslim Brotherhood, who going back to the 50s is nothing more than a murderous band of thugs, so evil that even though Nasser used them to get to power, as soon as he got power, he threw them all in prison because he knew he couldn't trust them. And they stayed there until they finally got enough of them out to help create the revolution, take the power, put a person like Morsi in office, who so oppressed the Egyptian people that they started wishing they had Mubarak back. And finally, General Assisi became president, and you would think that the United States would have embraced him and celebrated him for the leadership that he was going to bring and the religious freedom that he was trying to bring at really the expense of his own life. And instead, what did we do? We condemned him, and we pushed Egypt into the arms of Vladimir Putin. We created some crazy dance partners out there on the world dance stage. This is not dancing with the stars. This is dancing with wolves. And we better start understanding the serious nature of it, and do it quickly.
I think the growing threat of not only from Russia, but the growing strength of China represent a failure of this president's foreign policies, a failure that you can summarize with his own words of trying to lead from behind. I think what we're witnessing is the first president in our country's history who does not believe in American exceptionalism. He truly wants to give foreign capitals a veto power over our foreign policy. You know, in 2012, I went around Iowa and other states when I was campaigning for our candidate saying that President Obama was the worst president since Jimmy Carter. After the re-election, I actually went to D.C. to speak at CPAC, and I apologized to the president saying that was disrespectful and that I had insulted Jimmy Carter by saying that. I mean, think about it. Jimmy Carter was incompetent, but he believed in American exceptionalism. President Obama does not believe in American exceptionalism. And you can see that at a time when our federal government is spending a greater share of our economy than at any point since World War II over the last few years, we're also spending a lower percentage of our economy on our defense needs. I want you to think about that. The Constitution gives one obligation to the federal government: to protect our country. It is the most important thing the federal government is supposed to do. Instead, this president's got the federal government doing so many things it should be doing, he's actually neglecting our core responsibilities. And so we wrote a foreign policy and defense paper talking about reinvesting in our military, and it did start, the senator was right, in terms of Putin, it did start in 2009 when we withdrew those interceptors, the plans, and we didn't install those interceptors in Poland and the Czech Republic. The message that Putin got with the famous reset that Secretary Clinton, then Secretary Clinton, delivered was that this was not a White House to be feared or to be respected. And what I worry is a part of the reason this president has been so soft on Putin and on Russia may be that he was so eager to get a deal done with Iran, he doesn't want to alienate some of these other countries. And I hope that's not true, but I fear that's true. When you look at his response to the Green Revolution, his response to Syria, again and again, he seems to be backing off our adversaries and not supporting our allies. When it comes to China, we've got countries in Asia, including allies like South Korea and Taiwan and Japan, looking for American leadership. But you also have non-aligned countries. And you have countries that haven't normally been aligned with us, like Vietnam, and other countries looking to America saying, we need your leadership to hedge against the rising threat of China. So there is an opportunity with stronger leadership. Leading from behind doesn't work. Alienating our friends doesn't work. Appeasing our enemies doesn't work. We have had 6 years of this, and we're on track now. We're on track to have fewer soldiers, fewer and older planes and ships. We're on track now not to have the equipment our military needs. We need to reverse that. We need to invest in the Pentagon. We need to make sure that we are absolutely standing by our friends, sending a clear message to our enemies. We will stand up for America's interests. I'd like to see more brigades through NATO in Eastern Europe to reassure our allies and send a message to Russia. But I worry, given this president's policies, those brigades won't be available to send that clear message. We need to do a better job staying with our allies and getting our enemies to understand America will not back down from our interests, our people, or our allies.
It's pretty depressing, isn't it, just to listen to all this, how bad the situation has become over the past 6 years. Here's the good news. We went through a very similar thing back in the 1970s with Jimmy Carter. One election and one president can make a difference. I can say that with really no fear of contradiction because number one, it's happened in the past, but number two, unlike domestic policy, where historically the president has to, I say historically because the president hasn't necessarily done that, but has to have worked with Congress in order to get things done, to move domestic policy in this country. With respect to national security and foreign policy, the president does in fact set the agenda. And this president has, as you can hear from all of the discussion we've heard, systematically taken America from a position of strength and leadership, not just military leadership and economic leadership, but moral leadership, and has just thrown it all away. Has decided, as you heard, that America has no right to lead. He sees America as somebody, you listen to his speeches, he sees America as someone who's undermined the future of the world, positive outlook for the world. Someone who's undermined and apologizes to our enemies and turns our back systematically on our allies. Anybody that's been with us is suspect because they joined with us in our effort to expand democracy, freedom, and opportunity around the world. The president doesn't believe we have the right to lead. He believes the American government is incompetent in international affairs and supremely competent on everything else domestic. Doesn't think we can do anything right overseas, and we should do everything as a government here at home. This is the viewpoint, and yet you, the American people, can make a difference. We can elect a president who will say that when America speaks, we will stand by what we say. We will protect our interests around the world. We will be involved where our national security is very important, because a lot of people are going to listen to these answers and say, you're Republicans, they're just a bunch of warmongers. No, we're not. We're going to protect our interests, and we're going to make sure that this world is a place where America can have a rightful place in making this world a safer and better place. And by doing so, America is a safer and better place. You look at what's just going on. We haven't talked about what's going on just in the Americas. Right now, there's a meeting of the Organization of American States. And for the first time, Cuba now sits at that table. Sits at that table because the President of the United States, contrary to the bylaws of the Organization for American States, that said you have to be a democratically elected leader, the President of the United States has said, no, it's okay. We'll allow Cuba, who has fomented communism and terror all throughout that hemisphere. If you look at the situation the last 6 years in El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, and Ecuador, now even in Argentina, and even Colombia, one of our closest allies, those countries have turned away from us, turned away from capitalism, turned away from democracy, all because of Cuba and Venezuela and their petrodollars. And what does this president do? He opens up relationship with Cuba, gives them a position of honor at the Organization for American States. What message does it send? It sends a very dangerous message to the enemies of our country, and an equally dangerous message to our friends. Colombia, they no longer can trust us to be there for them in an increasingly hostile South America. This is what one election is so important. We have lots of issues. There's probably no more important issue than getting it right on America's preeminence in the world again.